Hello, bookworms. I'm Electra Nanu, and this is my debut book, Roa Seeks. It's the first part of the Aerieti Chronicles of the Fall. What that means will be broken down throughout the series, but there are a few things I can tell you about it now. It's epic fantasy slash science fantasy. It follows the secretive and big life-changing events in a world or planet called Eternia. And the first book follows Micha Rowe, a halfling secret agent of the Aerieti, what we know as angels. Through a mediator, he's sent to Eternia to investigate why demons are suddenly a lot more active. At the same time, he needs to track down an exiled elf demon hunter who may or may not help him. The more Micha investigates, the more he comes to realise that there's a lot more going on under the surface, including demons seeking out the elusive key of Krantil, which could and has in the past opened a gateway to hell. So a bit of pressure, but he's of course encouraged by the many very interesting friendships he makes along the way. So that is more or less the bare bones of the book and the series. What I thought would be a fun activity is do a reading. So I chose chapter 24. It's one of the more descriptive sections, but I chose it because it says a bit more about who Micha is. His background, his tense family relations, and his internal struggle. At this point in the story, he's not in a very good place. He's basically lost most of his possessions, including his signature jazz hat. He doesn't really know where he is, and he's wounded. So, yes, not a very happy boy. I hope you enjoy the reading, hopefully the book. If you have any questions, comments, anything you want to share, feel free to get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. So that's it from me, and here comes the reading. Chapter 24. No healer? Micha echoed in dismay. As I say, the farmer sighed. They all gone to market in Anvidor, including the midwife. She may have helped thy hand, but... He continued to gape at the middle-aged woman. Her mane of greying black wire was held back from her thin face by a dull orange ribbon. The sun had kissed her cheeks and nose. She was dressed in a plain woolen dress of a brown that reminded Micha of the leaves beneath that tree he had rested under. There was a white pocketed apron around her waist, smeared with grass and earth, drooping with the assortment of gardening tools it contained. "Is there nothing you could offer me?" he pleaded, clutching his throbbing arm. "I can break a fever or fix a cut, but that—" With disgust she pointed at the scarlet, pus-ridden tragedy that his forearm had become. "Is beyond my healing." He dropped his head, dejected. This was the last of 14 houses that made up the nameless village. No matter how he smiled or tried to reason and beg with them, he was shunned. Awkward apologies, slamming doors, insults. The temptation of offering the compass in exchange for shelter was quelled in an instant. Such a treasure did not belong in the hands of some heartless human. "Wait here," the woman grumbled, and he smiled after her as she entered the house. Micha unconsciously held his breath, waiting for her to reappear with some kind of poultice or food. At least one of the villagers had been kind enough to give him a full water skin. Micha had already drunk half of it. The woman emerged with something in her arms. It was clothes. "Here, they were my son's," she explained, and handed them to Micha. A tattered grey shirt, brown breeches, and worn leather sandals. It was all she had to spare. "At least my corpse will be dressed," Micha thought bitterly, but gave the woman his thanks. He stalked off down the road, wincing with every step his blistered feet took along the hard, rocky path. After a while he approached the nearest tree and hid behind it. He stripped off his torn clothes and pulled on the new ones. He sat down to button up the shirt and strap on the sandals. Stretching his legs, he peered round at the road. Up and down he looked, but there was no sign of movement. so he clutched the water skin and got back to his feet. He skipped a little when he felt the blisters in his soles again. They throbbed and prickled, but the thin layer of leather between them and the earth was already offering some comfort. If only he had something to relieve his hunger as well. The nuts had all been devoured by the time the sun had turned the peach red of evening. Bearing his wretchedness, Micha trudged on alongside the road, and dusk's now murky purple and orange radiance. The moons and stars were already watching from above. He kept glancing over his shoulder and at the vast grassland that surrounded him. If there was any danger, the darkness was hiding it. His fragile mental state was not helping either. Every effort his legs made sent warm pulses through his body. Not a pleasant heat, but the uncomfortable, feverish kind. He was certain that his festering arm was to blame, but there was nothing he could do. Nothing except keep walking. There was help to be found somewhere along the way. There had to be. The night whispered by, and so did Micha. His steps soft and listless through the grass. It was blackened by the gloom, yet it often twinkled with moonlight captured in its dew. The shimmering haze and the quiet had an enthralling effect on Micha. They made his addled mind wander through times and worlds. He flew again upon the backs of giant dragonflies in the wilds of Ornaca. His lungs breathed the blue waters of Fadeira, where the mer people had granted him gills and fins to traverse their oceanic kingdom. His nose recalled the stench of industry and machine-reeled Konzor. He still had difficulty understanding the laws of physics that made up Yiji, the world where time and everything it encompassed moved backwards. He revisited all the souls he had rescued from ruin, all the moments of triumph when failure and death had been a certainty. Oparu immediately came to mind, its flamboyant America racing to the rhythm of jazz, a chapter in Micha's life marked by both splendor and sorrow. He unconsciously tried to touch his hat, but it was not there. Tears filled his eyes. It made him sadder still to think that, after all those victories, he might fail the Aerieti in the greatest mission of them all. His thoughts returned home, to his family. If they knew where he was, if they knew he was in danger, would any of them come to his rescue? Or would they, like Jacob, think that he should face the consequences of his choices alone? Their ungratefulness infuriated Micha, but then he remembered once again that they did not know. They would never know that the most disgraceful of roes, their son and brother, was in fact a hero, and a soon-to-be martyr. He removed the stopper from the water skin and took a swig. There was not much left. He would have to make it last, despite his terrible thirst. His fever sucked in seconds every drop he consumed, leaving him feeling drier than before. Micha plugged the skin and returned his attention to the horizon. The tips of trees were like black arrowheads poking at the starry, bruise-blue sky. 1 foot ahead of the other, through chill and dirt and jagged rocks, he followed the road. If he did not, he would surely lose his way to wander in an aimless stupor until, if not an animal or a blade, his ailment took him. He felt it in his swollen arm, the sickened blood flowing through and into the rest of his body. The pain would not cease no matter what Micha did. At first it had felt as if burning foam was building up in his hand, gradually spreading and numbing its way to his shoulder. Now the pulsing foam was threatening to burst through his skin, rendering even the slightest motion of his fingers a torment. His legs carried him of their own accord. He did not know how much time had passed before he reached the first of the trees. It was still dark and eerily hushed, but he thought nothing of it. There was no emotion left in him, no apprehension, no anger, no melancholy, only a blank longing for the grave. As he passed by the copse, a breeze picked up. It crept under his clothing. He hunched in a frail attempt to hide from the ethereal fingers tickling his skin. They tugged at his breeches and sleeves, as if urging him to turn to the trees, but he shrugged them off. So they pushed harder, until he surrendered to his need for shelter. Micha trotted into the grove, looking right and left, from canopy to floor, Branches clacked against each other like chattering teeth. The leaves made a good effort of keeping all celestial light out of their dwelling. The wind was even more unwelcome. Try as it might, only a faint draught touched Micha now. He heaved a sigh, and when deep enough, plopped himself onto the ground. He cradled his arm and rocked gently from side to side. Closing his eyes, he took a shaky breath, held it, released it, and a flood of tears followed. It was not the fear of death that made him weep. It was not the loss of his hat or the pain in his hand. It was the helplessness, the feeling that he had proven all his slanderers right. He was too small for these big affairs. He was ill-suited for the mission, and what little worth the ghost lady had seen in him was false. All he had accomplished was to get himself lost and killed by a measly infection. He was no hero. Jacob was right. He was nothing but a miscreant, a good-for-nothing roe. He doubled over and lay in the soft grass. Perhaps if his hat had still been with him, things would have happened differently. But did he deserve the hat? It was supposed to protect his soul, but his soul had already been marred before Oparu. He had been sent there to guide one more ward to his destiny. Curiosity and his failing attempts to help this troubled human had led Micha from bar to bar, drinking spirits and listening to jazz. As usual, his eyes would draw fascinated, often mocking glances, but he had soon found a friend in a wizened fellow, dark of skin and sharp of mind. His deep, godlike voice still reverberated in Micha's memories. The man had told him all about that part of Oparu called the United States of America and the war that had recently shaken the world. Then the wise man had removed his hat and given it to Micha. "To shelter your soul," he had said in a secretive manner. The ward had eventually found his way, 5 days before the old man was brutally murdered. Dry leaves crackled nearby. Micha's eyelids quivered. He peered through the slits. A huge black figure loomed over him, blotting out what little light there was. Gleaming eyes of white gold stared down at him. The last thing he felt before losing consciousness were jaws clamping shut around his shoulder.